Welcome, fellow voyagers of the endless seas, to the profound exploration of the invisible force that shapes the very soul of the pirate world. Tonight, we journey through the mystical realm of Haki, the manifestation of willpower itself, the spiritual energy that flows through every living being, like an ocean current of pure intention. From the legendary Supreme King's Haki that bends reality to one's will, to the subtle whispers of the voice of all things that connect souls across impossible distances. This is the complete chronicle of power made manifest through determination alone. Rest peacefully as we explore these invisible forces that bind the world together. In the grand tapestry of existence that encompasses the endless seas and countless islands of the pirate world, there flows a current more powerful than any ocean tide, more fundamental than the very winds that fill a ship's sails. This invisible force courses through every living being, like the lifeblood of consciousness itself, connecting dream to reality through the sheer intensity of individual will. Tonight, we drift into the profound mysteries of Haki, that manifestation of spiritual energy that transforms mere desire into tangible power, mere intention into world-shaping force. The word itself carries weight beyond its simple pronunciation, borrowed from the ancient tongues that first recognized what modern pirates have come to understand as the truest source of strength. Haki represents nothing less than willpower made manifest, the ability of a sufficiently determined soul to impose their intentions upon the fabric of reality itself. It flows beneath the surface of every significant moment in the grand adventure, invisible to those who lack the awareness to perceive it, yet undeniably present in the clash of titans and the quiet resolve of heroes who refuse to surrender their dreams. Long before the term Haki became common knowledge among the world's most powerful pirates, its effects were felt throughout the seas in ways both subtle and profound. When a young monkey D, Luffy first encountered red-haired Shanks in the taverns of Fushia village, he was witnessing the casual display of spiritual pressure that emanated from someone whose will had been forged in the crucible of the Grand Line's most dangerous waters. The respect that Shanks commanded was not built upon reputation alone, but upon the unconscious recognition that lesser spirits felt when confronted with the presence of someone who had never truly doubted their own convictions. The mountain bandits who threatened the peaceful village learned this lesson in the most direct way possible, their crude understanding of power crumbling before forces they could not see or comprehend. When Shanks walked among them with the calm confidence of someone who had faced far greater threats, his very presence spoke to something primal in their awareness, a recognition that they stood before someone whose will operated on an entirely different scale than their own. The wood of Whitebeard's ship would later crack beneath his footsteps, the physical world responding to spiritual pressure that exceeded what mere matter could comfortably contain. These early glimpses into the nature of invisible power would prove to be harbingers of revelations that would reshape understanding of what strength truly meant in a world where individual determination could challenge the fundamental laws of nature. The devil fruits that granted seemingly impossible abilities were not the ultimate expression of power, but merely one facet of a larger truth about the relationship between will and reality. Those who possessed sufficient spiritual strength could influence the world around them without relying upon any external source of power, drawing instead from wells of determination that ran deeper than any ocean. The classification of Haki into three distinct types represents an attempt to understand forces that operate according to principles that transcend conventional physics, spiritual energies that respond to emotion and intention, rather than mechanical manipulation. Busoshoku, the color of arms, allows practitioners to coat themselves in invisible armor forged from pure will, creating defenses that can withstand attacks that would shatter mountains, while simultaneously enabling a fence that can harm beings who should be untouchable. Kenbun Shoku, the color of observation, amplifies awareness beyond the limitations of physical senses, granting perception that can pierce through deception and anticipate danger before it fully manifests. And how Shoku, the color of the Supreme King, represents the rarest and most profound expression of spiritual dominance, the ability to impose one's will directly upon others without requiring physical interaction. Yet these categories, useful though they may be for understanding the general principles involved, fail to capture the deeply personal nature of how Haki manifests in each individual practitioner, like fingerprints or the unique patterns that waves carve into sand. No two people express their spiritual energy in exactly the same way. The gentle navigator who uses her heightened perception to guide her crew safely through treacherous waters demonstrates the same fundamental force as the battle-hardened swordsman who coats his blades in armor that can cut through anything, yet their applications could not be more different in character or purpose. The cultural variations in how different societies understand and teach these abilities speak to the universal nature of the underlying phenomenon, while highlighting the diverse ways that human consciousness can interact with spiritual energy. In the Sky Islands far above the Blue Sea, the priests spoke of mantra, their term for what the surface world would come to know as observation Haki. Their understanding was shaped by lives spent among the clouds, where survival depended upon the ability to sense threats that approached from all directions across vast expanses of empty sky. The techniques they developed reflected this environment, emphasizing range and precision over the close quarters applications that would prove more useful in the confined spaces of ship-to-ship combat. Wano country's isolation had allowed their understanding of spiritual energy to develop along entirely different lines, their concept of Riwo focusing on the flowing nature of invisible force rather than its static applications. Where other traditions might teach students to think of armament as armor to be worn, Wano's masters understood it as a river to be channeled, something that moved and changed according to the needs of the moment. This philosophical difference would prove crucial when Luffy arrived in the land of samurai. His previous understanding of armament sufficient for many challenges, but inadequate for penetrating the defenses of creatures whose scales had been hardened by decades of battle experience. The relationship between Haki and Devil Fruit abilities represents one of the most fascinating aspects of how spiritual energy interacts with other forms of power in the pirate world. Where Devil Fruits grant specific abilities that operate according to their own internal logic, Haki provides a more fundamental form of enhancement that can potentially overcome any specific technique through sheer force of will. The Logia users who had once seemed invincible, their elemental bodies rendering physical attacks meaningless, found themselves vulnerable to opponents who could coat their strikes in sufficient spiritual energy to bypass their intangible defenses. This discovery revolutionized combat throughout the New World, transforming conflicts between powerful pirates from contests of unique abilities into tests of fundamental willpower and spiritual strength. The admirals whose elemental powers had once made them seem like forces of nature learned that they too could be touched and harmed by those who possessed sufficient mastery of invisible force. The balance of power shifted as understanding spread, creating an arms race of spiritual development that pushed the strongest fighters to explore depths of determination they had never previously accessed. The question of why some individuals possess greater natural affinity for Haki than others touches upon mysteries that may never be fully explained, tied as they seem to be to the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. Some, like those born with the potential for conquerors Haki, appear to enter the world with spiritual energy that already operates on scales that most people never achieve through any amount of training. Others develop their abilities through trials that forge their will in the fires of desperate necessity, their growth born from circumstances that demanded transcendence or death. The emotional component of Haki cannot be overlooked when considering how this invisible force shapes the course of events throughout the pirate world. Unlike the cold calculation of scientific advancement or the predictable applications of mechanical skill, spiritual energy responds to the practitioner's deepest convictions and most profound motivations. A fighter defending someone they love can access reserves of power that would remain forever beyond their reach in casual sparring or training exercises. The desperate mother protecting her child, the loyal subordinate shielding his captain, the dreamer refusing to abandon hope despite impossible odds. These emotional crucibles create the conditions where ordinary individuals can briefly touch the realm of the legendary. This connection between feeling and force explains why the most powerful practitioners of Haki tend to be those whose lives have been shaped by experiences of profound loss, overwhelming responsibility, or unshakable conviction. They have learned to draw upon emotional depths that others might prefer to leave unexplored, transforming pain into power and determination into destiny-altering strength. Their mastery comes not from technical perfection alone, but from the willingness to open themselves completely to forces that demand nothing less than absolute commitment. The invisible nature of Haki creates unique challenges for those attempting to understand its principles or teach its applications to others. Unlike sword techniques that can be observed and copied, or navigation skills that can be learned through study and practice, spiritual energy must be felt rather than seen, experienced rather than explained. The greatest masters often struggle to convey their knowledge to students, finding that words fail to capture the essence of techniques that operate according to intuition rather than logic. This ineffable quality has led to the development of teaching methods that rely more upon experience than explanation. Masters creating situations where students are forced to access their spiritual energy out of necessity rather than conscious intent. The training that produces genuine growth in Haki often involves facing challenges that cannot be overcome through conventional means, circumstances that demand the practitioner reach beyond their perceived limitations to discover capabilities they never knew they possessed. The meditation traditions that some masters incorporate into their teaching recognize that spiritual energy flows most freely when the conscious mind steps aside, allowing deeper aspects of the psyche to guide the flow of invisible force. The quiet contemplation that might seem at odds with the violent applications of combat-focused Haki serves a crucial role in developing the internal awareness necessary for advanced techniques. Only when practitioners understand the subtle currents of their own spiritual energy can they hope to direct those currents towards specific purposes or blend different types of Haki into seamless expressions of will made manifest. Among the countless mysteries that define the world of pirates and dreams, none carries greater weight or more profound implications than the phenomenon known as conqueror's Haki, that rarest manifestation of spiritual energy that marks its possessors as beings destined to stand above the multitudes. This supreme expression of willpower occurs in only one individual among every million souls that draw breath, a ratio so impossibly small that entire generations may pass without witnessing its awakening. Yet when it does emerge, it announces itself with such undeniable authority that even the strongest warriors must acknowledge they stand in the presence of someone whose very existence challenges the natural order of things. The designation of Supreme King carries implications that extend far beyond mere combat prowess or political authority, touching upon something fundamental about the nature of leadership and the mysterious forces that determine which individuals possess the spiritual gravity necessary to draw others into their orbit. These are not abilities that can be taught or learned through any amount of training, no matter how rigorous or prolonged. The potential for Conqueror's Haki exists as an immutable aspect of certain souls, from the moment of their birth, as integral to their essential nature as the color of their eyes or the rhythm of their heartbeat. This reality creates a fascinating paradox within the democratic ideals that many pirates claim to embrace. The recognition that some forms of power truly are inherited rather than earned, bestowed by forces beyond human understanding rather than achieved through dedication and sacrifice. The possessors of Conqueror's Haki find themselves burdened with capabilities they never requested, marked as different from their peers in ways that can never be hidden or suppressed for long. Their very presence alters the dynamics of every situation they enter, creating ripples of influence that spread far beyond their conscious intentions. The young Monkey D. Luffy discovered this truth during his earliest adventures, his unconscious releases of spiritual pressure occurring during moments of extreme emotion or protective instinct. At Marineford, when Portgas D. Ace faced execution before his horrified eyes, something deep within Luffy's soul refused to accept the helplessness of watching someone he loved die for crimes that existed only in the twisted logic of those who ruled through fear rather than justice. The wave of Conqueror's Haki that erupted from his anguish was not a technique deployed with conscious intent, but rather the spontaneous expression of a will so absolute that it could not be contained within the boundaries of a single human form. The Marines and pirates who collapsed around him in that moment were not struck down by any physical force, but overwhelmed by the sheer intensity of spiritual energy that proclaimed, louder than any spoken declaration, that this 17-year-old boy possessed the fundamental nature of someone born to command rather than follow. The unconscious demonstration provided glimpse into potentials that Luffy himself did not yet understand, capabilities that would require years of growth and countless trials to fully manifest in forms that could be directed with precision rather than merely unleashed in moments of desperate emotion. The sight of red-haired Shanks boarding the Moby Dick to request an audience with Whitebeard remains one of the most memorable early demonstrations of how Conqueror's Haki operates when wielded by someone who has achieved true mastery over their spiritual energy. The Emperor's casual stroll across the deck of his rival's flagship should have been impossible. A lone individual walking openly among hundreds of pirates who owed their loyalty to someone else entirely. Yet the pressure that emanated from Shanks's presence was so overwhelming that seasoned warriors found themselves collapsing without understanding why their own strength had suddenly abandoned them. The wood beneath his feet groaned and cracked under forces that had nothing to do with physical weight, the ship itself responding to spiritual pressure that exceeded what inanimate matter could comfortably bear. This was not an attack in any conventional sense, not an attempt to harm or intimidate through displays of violence, but simply the natural consequence of someone whose willpower operated on scales that ordinary reality struggled to accommodate. Shanks himself seemed almost unaware of the devastation his mere presence was causing, his attention focused entirely on the diplomatic mission that had brought him to seek conversation with the world's strongest man. The casual nature of this demonstration revealed truths about the hierarchy that existed among those who possessed Conqueror's Haki. The recognition that even within this exclusive group, vast differences in mastery separated the newly awakened from those who had spent decades learning to channel their spiritual energy with surgical precision. The Marines who had fainted were not weak by any reasonable standard, yet they found themselves as helpless as children before forces that operated according to principles their training had never prepared them to understand or resist. This overwhelming presence technique represents perhaps the most fundamental application of Supreme King's Haki, the ability to project one's will with such intensity that weaker spirits simply cannot maintain consciousness in its vicinity. The effect is not limited to humans, extending to any creature whose mental fortitude proves insufficient to withstand the spiritual pressure of someone whose determination has been forged into an unbreakable force. Wild beasts that might terrorize entire islands find themselves cowering before conquerors' users, their survival instincts recognizing threats that operate on levels their natural aggression cannot address. The philosophical implications of this power touch upon uncomfortable questions about the nature of free will and individual autonomy, the possibility that some souls possess such gravitational force that others cannot help but be drawn into their orbit. The unconscious submission that conquerors' Haki can induce raises troubling parallels to the kind of absolute authority that tyrants throughout history have sought to establish through more conventional means. Yet the users who earn genuine respect and loyalty seem to wield their abilities with restraint that speaks to wisdom rather than mere self-interest, understanding that true leadership requires the willing cooperation of followers rather than their forced subjugation. The selection process, by which certain individuals are born with the potential for Supreme King's Haki, remains one of the greatest mysteries in a world filled with inexplicable phenomena, seeming to operate according to criteria that transcend conventional understanding of genetics or environmental influence. Children born to parents with no history of such abilities may suddenly manifest spiritual pressure that exceeds anything their ancestors ever achieved, while the offspring of legendary conquerors' users might live entire lives without ever accessing the power that defined their lineage. This unpredictability suggests that the forces responsible for determining who receives such gifts operate according to purposes that extend beyond human comprehension, perhaps connected to the mysterious currents of inherited will that seem to flow through certain bloodlines across generations. The patterns that emerge when examining the historical distribution of conquerors' Haki point towards something approaching destiny rather than random chance, as if the world itself somehow identifies individuals whose future actions will require capabilities that ordinary humans could never hope to possess. The burden that accompanies such power cannot be understated, particularly for those who discover their abilities during childhood or adolescence, when the psychological frameworks necessary for understanding such responsibility have not yet fully developed. The young Doflamingo's early demonstrations of conquerors' Haki occurred during traumatic circumstances that shaped his understanding of power in ways that would poison every relationship he formed throughout his life, his spiritual gifts becoming tools of domination rather than protection. The isolation that often accompanies the possession of Supreme King's Haki creates psychological challenges that can prove as difficult to overcome as any external enemy. The recognition that one's very nature sets them apart from the vast majority of humanity in ways that can never be completely bridged or shared. The loneliness of command becomes literal when one's presence can render others unconscious, when casual interactions must be carefully modulated to avoid overwhelming those who lack sufficient spiritual fortitude to withstand proximity to such concentrated willpower. Yet this isolation also forges bonds of extraordinary depth among those rare individuals who do possess comparable abilities, creating relationships that operate according to different rules than those that govern ordinary human interaction. When two conquerors' users meet as equals, their spiritual energies recognize and respond to each other in ways that transcend conscious communication, establishing understanding that bypasses the need for words or explanations. The rivalry between Luffy and Kaido, Whitebeard's acknowledgement of Roger's strength, the complex relationship between Shanks and his former crewmates, all of these connections are shaped by the mutual recognition of souls that operate on similar frequencies. The unconscious nature of many early manifestations creates additional complications for those attempting to understand or control their abilities. Spiritual energy, responding to emotional states rather than deliberate intent in ways that can produce devastating consequences at the worst possible moments. The teenager who discovers their conqueror's haki during a moment of anger or frustration may find themselves surrounded by the unconscious bodies of friends and family members. The realization that their very emotions pose potential danger to those they care about most. This lack of conscious control drives many newly awakened conquerors' users to seek isolation until they can develop sufficient mastery to regulate their spiritual emissions, a self-imposed exile that further compounds the loneliness inherent in possessing such rare abilities. The learning process requires not just technical skill but emotional maturity, the wisdom to understand when such power should be restrained rather than expressed, when leadership demands the suppression of one's own will in service of greater purposes. The connection between conqueror's haki and the pursuit of ultimate freedom creates fascinating tensions within the personalities of those who possess it. Spirits strong enough to impose their will upon reality, yet wise enough to recognize that true strength sometimes requires accepting limitations rather than transcending them. The greatest users of Supreme King's haki demonstrate remarkable restraint in their applications of such overwhelming power, understanding that the casual use of abilities that can render others unconscious represents a form of violence regardless of the user's intentions. This restraint becomes particularly important when considering the dreams and ambitions that drive most conquerors' users toward positions of leadership and authority. Their natural charisma and overwhelming presence, attracting followers who may not fully understand the forces that draw them to serve someone else's vision. The responsibility of wielding influence over others who cannot resist one's spiritual pressure demands a level of moral consideration that many individuals never develop. The recognition that power without wisdom inevitably leads to corruption and the betrayal of the very ideals that initially justified its pursuit. The rare few who achieve true mastery over their conqueror's haki demonstrate abilities that border on the miraculous, their spiritual energy becoming so precisely controlled that they can affect specific targets within crowds while leaving others completely untouched. The surgical application of overwhelming willpower allows these masters to communicate complex messages through nothing more than modulated spiritual pressure, conveying threats, promises, or acknowledgements without speaking a single word. The evolution from unconscious emission to conscious control represents one of the most challenging developmental processes in the entire spectrum of human potential, requiring practitioners to confront aspects of their own nature that they may prefer to leave unexplored. The spiritual energy that manifests as conqueror's haki draws upon the deepest wells of individual conviction and ambition, forcing its users to examine their most fundamental beliefs about themselves and their place in the world. Those who successfully navigate this process emerge transformed in ways that extend far beyond their enhanced combat capabilities, their understanding of leadership and responsibility refined through intimate contact with forces that operate according to principles of pure will. They become living examples of what human consciousness can achieve when freed from the limitations that most people accept as immutable, their very existence serving as inspiration for others who dare to dream of transcending their own perceived boundaries. As the gentle currents of understanding carry us deeper into the mysteries of spiritual supremacy, let the weight of such profound power settle into your consciousness like sediment in still water. The recognition that some souls are born to reshape the world around them through sheer force of will provides both comfort and challenge. The knowledge that extraordinary potential exists within the realm of possibility while remaining forever beyond the reach of ordinary ambition. The evolution from basic conqueror's Haki to its advanced manifestations represents one of the most profound transformations in spiritual development, marking the transition from unconscious emission of overwhelming presence to the deliberate manipulation of reality itself through focused willpower, where the fundamental expression of Supreme King's Haki operates primarily through intimidation and the subjugation of weaker spirits. Its advanced applications transcend such crude displays of dominance to achieve effects that seem to violate the very laws of physics upon which the natural world is built. This transformation does not occur through training in any conventional sense, cannot be achieved through repetitive exercises or academic study of theoretical principles. Instead, it emerges from the crucible of conflicts so intense that they demand capabilities beyond anything the practitioner previously imagined possible. Spiritual evolution driven by circumstances that accept nothing less than transcendence or complete destruction. The masters who eventually achieve such heights of ability share common experiences of being pushed beyond every limit they thought defined their essential nature, forced to discover depths of determination that had remained hidden even from themselves. The visual manifestation of advanced conqueror's Haki through crackling black lightning serves as unmistakable evidence that the user has crossed the threshold from merely projecting their will to actively imposing it upon the fabric of reality. These ethereal discharges dance through the air like living things, following patterns that speak to the controlled chaos of spiritual energy, operating at frequencies that ordinary matter struggles to accommodate. The lightning does not burn or electrocute in any conventional sense, yet its presence indicates forces at work that can reshape the fundamental nature of anything they touch. When Monkey D. Luffy first witnessed this phenomenon during his desperate battles atop Onigashima, the sight filled him with wonder that transcended even his natural enthusiasm for discovering new techniques and abilities. The realization that Conqueror's Haki could be woven directly into physical attacks opened possibilities that had never occurred to him during his previous understanding of spiritual energy as primarily defensive or intimidating force. The moment of recognition when he understood that the strongest fighters in the world were coating their strikes with the same overwhelming will that had once been limited to rendering weaker opponents unconscious, marked a crucial turning point in his development as both warrior and leader. The technical achievement of coating attacks with advanced Conqueror's Haki requires a level of spiritual control that borders on the supernatural, the ability to maintain perfect harmony between overwhelming force and surgical precision. The practitioner must learn to channel energies that naturally tend toward explosive release into forms stable enough to enhance specific techniques without overwhelming the very attacks they are meant to strengthen. This delicate balance demands not just raw power, but wisdom about when to apply such devastating capabilities and when restraint serves better purposes than absolute dominance. The non-contact combat applications that emerge from mastery of advanced Conqueror's Haki represent perhaps the most philosophically challenging aspect of spiritual development, the demonstration that sufficiently focused will can inflict devastating damage without requiring physical interaction between combatants. When Luffy's fists began connecting with Kaido's massive form without actually touching his scales, observers witnessed the breakdown of fundamental assumptions about the relationship between cause and effect in combat situations. This transcendence of physical limitation speaks to deeper truths about the nature of reality itself. in a world where spiritual energy operates according to principles that extend far beyond conventional understanding of matter and energy. The space between combatants becomes not empty void, but medium through which concentrated willpower can travel, carrying with it all the devastating force that would normally require direct contact to transmit. The implications of such abilities extend far beyond their immediate tactical applications, suggesting that the strongest individuals in the world exist partially outside the constraints that govern ordinary human experience. The environmental manipulation that accompanies the highest expressions of advanced conquerors' Haki creates effects so dramatic that they can be observed from impossible distances, their influence spreading far beyond the immediate vicinity of the practitioners involved. When Gol D. Roger and Edward Newgate crossed blades on their legendary encounter, the clash of their supreme wills generated atmospheric disturbances that affected weather patterns across entire island chains, their spiritual energies interacting with natural forces in ways that transformed meteorological phenomena into expressions of human determination. The sight of their weapons failing to make contact yet producing effects normally associated with the collision of opposing forces provided clear demonstration that advanced practitioners operate according to different rules than those that govern ordinary combat. The massive gust of wind that swept across the battlefield spoke not to any manipulation of air currents through conventional means, but rather to the displacement of reality itself by wills so absolute that the physical world had no choice but to reshape itself around their confrontation. This same principle manifested during the climactic battle between Luffy and Kaido, their spiritual energies reaching such heights of intensity that the very heavens seemed to recoil from the forces being unleashed below. The splitting of clouds above Onigashima was not mere meteorological coincidence, but direct result of Conqueror's Haki operating on scales that dwarfed anything either combatant had previously achieved, their wills literally carving rifts through atmospheric layers as they sought to establish dominance over each other. The philosophical implications of such power touch upon fundamental questions about the relationship between individual consciousness and collective reality. The possibility that sufficiently developed spirits can impose their personal understanding of how the world should function upon the shared experience of everyone around them. The sky splitting in response to human will suggest that reality itself is more malleable than conventional wisdom would suggest, more responsive to focused intention than scientific materialism would consider possible. Red-haired Shanks's demonstration of environmental manipulation during his brief encounter with Eustace Kid provided perhaps the most economical yet devastating display of how advanced Conqueror's Haki can reshape physical circumstances to serve the user's immediate purposes. The sheer burst of spiritual pressure that accompanied his intervention sent shockwaves through both sea and sky, creating tsunamis that threatened ships positioned miles away from the actual confrontation, while simultaneously communicating unmistakable messages about the consequences that would follow any continued aggression. The precision with which Shanks controlled these environmental effects spoke to mastery that went far beyond raw power, demonstrating the surgical application of overwhelming force in ways that achieved maximum psychological impact while minimizing unnecessary collateral damage. His ability to generate such dramatic results through what appeared to be casual effort revealed the vast gulf that separated the four emperors from even the most accomplished pirates of the worst generation, their spiritual development having reached plateaus that others might spend entire lifetimes attempting to achieve. The coating of weapons and attacks with advanced Conqueror's Haki creates capabilities that transcend the enhanced striking power normally associated with armament-based techniques, infusing physical assaults with spiritual energy that operates according to entirely different principles than conventional hardening or emission applications. Where armament Haki typically functions by increasing the density or penetrative power of attacks, Conqueror's coating adds dimensional aspects that seem to multiply force through methods that defy rational analysis. The black lightning that dances along weapons enhanced with Supreme King's Haki serves as visible evidence of energies that exist partially outside normal space-time, their ethereal nature allowing them to affect targets in ways that purely physical attacks never could. These discharges carry with them not just destructive potential, but the full weight of the user's spiritual presence, creating attacks that assault their targets on multiple levels simultaneously, overwhelming not just their physical defenses, but their psychological resistance as well. The integration of advanced Conqueror's Haki with existing fighting styles requires fundamental reconceptualization of combat philosophy, moving beyond techniques based on mechanical advantage or elemental manipulation to embrace approaches that treat conflict as clash between competing visions of reality. The practitioner must learn to fight not just with their body or their devil fruit abilities, but with the totality of their existence, channeling everything they are and everything they believe into expressions of will so pure that they become irresistible forces capable of overcoming any obstacle. This holistic approach to combat creates fighting styles that reflect the deepest aspects of each practitioner's personality and conviction, their techniques becoming extensions of their fundamental nature rather than learned skills applied from external sources. The way Luffy incorporates his Conqueror's coating into his rubber-based attacks speaks to his essential optimism and joy in discovery, transforming devastating techniques into expressions of creative enthusiasm that somehow maintain their lethal effectiveness, while celebrating the wonder of growth and development. The psychological demands of wielding such overwhelming power create unique challenges for practitioners who must learn to maintain their essential humanity while commanding forces that could easily corrupt lesser spirits into tyrants or monsters. The temptation to rely exclusively on spiritual dominance rather than developing genuine relationships with allies and subordinates represents a constant threat to the moral development of Conqueror's users, their natural authority potentially becoming a crutch that prevents them from learning more subtle forms of leadership. The greatest masters of advanced Conqueror's Haki demonstrate remarkable restraint in their applications of such overwhelming capabilities, understanding that the casual use of reality-altering power represents a form of violence against the natural order that demands careful consideration of consequences and alternatives. Their wisdom shows itself not in the devastating effects they can produce, but in their judgment about when such effects serve constructive rather than destructive purposes, when the imposition of their will upon others serves justice rather than mere convenience. The connection between advanced Conqueror's Haki and the mysterious legacy of Joy Boy suggests that the highest expressions of spiritual supremacy may be connected to forces that operate across centuries, rather than being limited to individual lifespans. The implications of such continuity touch upon questions about the nature of consciousness itself, the possibility that certain forms of will transcend the boundaries of individual existence to become part of larger patterns that shape historical development across generations. The burden of wielding power that can split the very heavens creates responsibilities that extend far beyond personal ambition or crew loyalty, forcing practitioners to consider their role in shaping the kind of world that will exist for future generations. The environmental effects of their confrontations serve as constant reminders that their conflicts affect not just themselves and their immediate opponents, but potentially every living being within vast ranges of their battles, their spiritual development carrying with it obligations to consider the welfare of countless others who possess no defense against the forces being unleashed. The manifestation of spiritual energy as tangible armor represents one of the most fundamental and widely utilized applications of human willpower in the pirate world, transforming the abstract concept of determination into protective force that can withstand attacks capable of shattering mountains and splitting seas. Busoshoku Haki, known throughout the world as the color of arms, provides practitioners with the ability to coat their physical forms in invisible barriers forged from pure resolve, creating defenses that operate according to principles entirely removed from conventional understanding of materials, science, or protective equipment. This armament of the spirit emerges not from external sources or manufactured goods, but from the depths of individual conviction, drawing upon wells of determination that exist within every conscious being, yet remain accessible only to those who possess sufficient strength of will to tap into their deepest reserves of spiritual energy. The process by which intangible resolve transforms into protective coating that can deflect bullets, absorb explosions, and turn aside bladed weapons speaks to mysteries about the fundamental nature of reality that even the most learned scholars struggle to comprehend fully. The democratic nature of armament Haki stands in marked contrast to the exclusive rarity of Conqueror's abilities. Its techniques theoretically available to anyone willing to undergo the rigorous training and psychological development necessary to access their spiritual energy in focused, deliberate ways. Yet this accessibility should not be mistaken for simplicity, as the mastery required to coat even small portions of one's body with effective armament demands years of dedicated practice, combined with the kind of battle experience that forges will into unbreakable instruments of protection and offense. The basic hardening technique that serves as the foundation for all armament applications requires practitioners to visualize their spiritual energy as flowing liquid that can be directed to specific locations according to conscious intent, pooling and solidifying wherever focus and need dictate its presence. The distinctive blackening that accompanies successful armament coating serves as visible evidence of invisible force. The darkened hue, indicating areas where willpower has achieved sufficient density to interact directly with physical matter in ways that transcend normal limitations. The sight of Vice Admiral Virgo demonstrating full-body armament coating during his confrontation with Trafalgar Law provided one of the most impressive displays of spiritual armor ever witnessed. His entire physical form transformed into weapon and shield simultaneously through the application of techniques that most practitioners never master, even in limited applications. The bamboo stick that he wielded became harder than steel, through nothing more than concentrated willpower. Its simple wooden structure, enhanced to the point where it could clash with surgical precision against opponents whose own weapons had been forged from the finest materials available to master craftsmen. This complete coverage technique represents the pinnacle of defensive armament mastery, requiring not just enormous reserves of spiritual energy, but the mental discipline necessary to maintain perfect control over dozens of coating applications simultaneously, while engaging in high-intensity combat that demands split-second decision-making and constant adaptation to changing tactical circumstances. The psychological pressure of maintaining such comprehensive protection while simultaneously coordinating offensive actions pushes practitioners to their absolute limits, forcing growth in areas of spiritual development that cannot be achieved through any form of peaceful training or meditation. The offensive applications of armament Haki transform ordinary human capabilities into forces that can challenge the mightiest creatures and most devastating natural phenomena coating attacks with spiritual energy that multiplies their destructive potential while enabling them to affect targets that should theoretically be immune to conventional physical assault. The fist, wrapped in invisible armor, becomes capable of striking with force that exceeds what mere muscle and bone could ever generate, channeling the totality of the practitioner's will into impacts that resonate through both physical and spiritual dimensions. The fundamental importance of armament Haki in confronting Logia Devil Fruit users cannot be overstated, as these elemental beings possess the ability to render themselves intangible to normal attacks, transforming their bodies into smoke, lightning, ice, or magma at will, to avoid damage that would prove fatal to any conventional opponent. The discovery that sufficiently concentrated spiritual energy could bypass these seemingly perfect defenses revolutionized combat throughout the Grand Line, suddenly making previously untouchable adversaries vulnerable to those who possessed the determination necessary to develop their armament capabilities. Admiral Aokiji's surprise when Monkey D, Luffy's armament-coated attacks actually connected during their brief skirmish at Long Ring Longland, demonstrated how dramatically the balance of power could shift when Logia users encountered opponents capable of treating their elemental forms as solid matter. The ice that had always provided perfect protection suddenly became as vulnerable as flesh and blood, forcing users who had grown accustomed to near invincibility to develop entirely new approaches to combat that acknowledged their own mortality. The psychological impact of losing intangibility extends far beyond mere tactical considerations, striking at the core identity of individuals who had built their entire sense of self around abilities that set them apart from ordinary humans. The realization that their elemental powers, no matter how devastating or exotic, could be overcome by sufficiently focused willpower, forces a fundamental re-evaluation of what strength truly means. In a world where spiritual development can transcend any specific technique or inherited advantage, the weapon enhancement capabilities of armament Haki create possibilities that extend far beyond simple hardening, enabling practitioners to imbue their tools and implements with spiritual energy that fundamentally alters their essential properties rather than merely increasing their durability or sharpness. A sword coated with armament becomes more than metal shaped for cutting, transforming into extension of the wielder's will that can slice through substances that should be impervious to any blade while maintaining perfect balance and responsiveness to the smallest adjustments in technique or intention. The distinctive black coloration that accompanies advanced weapon coating serves as visual representation of spiritual energy, achieving sufficient concentration to become permanently integrated with physical matter, creating implements that retain enhanced properties even when not actively being channeled with fresh applications of Haki. These blackened weapons represent the ultimate synthesis between human will and crafted tool, objects that have been transformed through constant exposure to spiritual energy into something approaching living extensions of their wielder's consciousness. Dracul Mihawk's explanation of how prolonged exposure to armament Haki can permanently alter blade composition provided crucial insight into the relationship between spiritual energy and physical matter, revealing that sufficiently intense and consistent applications of will can create changes that persist long after the initial coating has been exhausted. The black blades wielded by the world's greatest swordsmen serve as testament to decades of spiritual development, their transformed appearance indicating weapons that have been elevated beyond mere tools to become legendary artifacts worthy of being passed down through generations. The grading system that exists for evaluating blade quality takes on entirely new significance when viewed through the lens of armament enhancement, suggesting that the highest ranked weapons achieve their status not through superior materials or craftsmanship alone, but through the spiritual energy that has been invested in them over years or even decades of use by masters who understood the connection between will and steel. The supreme grade blades represent more than metallurgical excellence, embodying the accumulated determination of legendary figures whose spiritual development was so advanced that it permanently altered the fundamental nature of their weapons. Kozuki Oden's demonstration of advanced armament coating during his legendary battle with Kaido showed how properly applied spiritual energy could enable weapons to inflict lasting damage on opponents whose natural defenses should have rendered them effectively invulnerable to conventional attacks. The scars that his dual swords carved into the Emperor's dragon form persisted for decades afterward, serving as permanent reminder of the encounter, while proving that even the most durable creatures could be marked by those who possessed sufficient mastery of armament techniques. The fact that Oden's blades never achieved the permanent black coloration that indicates complete spiritual integration suggests that mastery of armament coating involves not just the ability to enhance weapons, but the consistency and duration necessary to create lasting transformation in their essential properties. The difference between temporary enhancement and permanent alteration speaks to levels of spiritual development that require not just raw power, but the kind of sustained commitment that can only emerge from absolute dedication to one's chosen path. The defensive applications of armament Haki extend far beyond simple damage reduction, creating protective barriers that can redirect force, absorb kinetic energy, and even provide limited protection against attacks that operate through supernatural rather than purely physical means. The practitioner learning to coat their skin with spiritual armor discovers that they can withstand impacts that should shatter bones, absorb heat that should burn flesh, and resist cutting forces that should sever limbs, their willpower literally interposing itself between their physical form and incoming harm. The training methodologies developed by different martial traditions reflect varied philosophical approaches to spiritual armor development, each emphasizing different aspects of the fundamental relationship between consciousness and protective force. The Marine's systematic approach focuses on gradual progression through standardized exercises designed to build consistent coating abilities across large numbers of personnel, while the more individualistic traditions favored by pirates tend to emphasize personal discovery and battle-tested development that emerges from actual combat experience, rather than controlled practice environments. Monkey D. Garp's training regimen of repeatedly striking battleships with his bare fists represents perhaps the most extreme approach to armament development ever documented. His methodology based on the principle that spiritual armor becomes strongest when forced to protect against forces that would otherwise cause devastating injury. The old Marine's philosophy that comfort and safety are enemies of growth drives training techniques that push practitioners to their absolute limits, while providing just enough protection to ensure survival rather than preventing all possibility of harm. The connection between emotional state and armament effectiveness creates fascinating complexities in how practitioners learn to access and maintain their spiritual armor, with feelings of determination, protectiveness, and righteous anger generally enhancing coating strength, while fear, doubt, and despair tend to weaken or completely disrupt the flow of spiritual energy. This emotional component means that armament Haki cannot be treated as purely mechanical skill, but must be understood as expression of the practitioner's entire psychological state and moral commitment to their chosen course of action. The meditation practices that some masters incorporate into armament training recognize that spiritual armor flows most naturally when the conscious mind achieves harmony with deeper aspects of the psyche. allowing protective instincts to guide the distribution of spiritual energy rather than relying entirely upon deliberate intellectual control. The paradox that effective protection sometimes requires letting go of conscious control reflects broader truths about the relationship between will and spiritual force throughout all applications of Haki. The social implications of widespread armament mastery extend far beyond individual combat effectiveness, creating possibilities for entire communities to develop collective defense capabilities that could theoretically challenge even the most powerful conventional military forces. The villages and islands that have successfully taught armament basics to significant portions of their population demonstrate resilience that goes far beyond what their numbers or resources would suggest. Their shared spiritual development, creating defensive networks that operate through cooperation rather than hierarchy. The economic impact of armament-enhanced craftsmanship opens new possibilities for artisans and creators whose work can be permanently improved through spiritual energy applications, their tools and techniques achieving results that surpass anything possible through conventional methods alone. The blacksmiths who learn to forge weapons while channeling armament into their hammers and anvils produce blades that possess inherent qualities unavailable through traditional metallurgy, their spiritual development directly translating into superior products that command premium prices throughout the world's markets. The mastery of advanced armament techniques represents a profound evolution in spiritual development that transcends the basic principles of protective coating to embrace concepts that seem to defy the fundamental laws of physics as they govern the interaction between matter and energy. Where elementary armament applications focus on creating barriers between the practitioner and incoming harm, these sophisticated methods allow spiritual energy to flow beyond the boundaries of physical form, creating effects that operate at distances and through mediums that conventional understanding would consider impossible. The philosophy underlying advanced armament mastery draws heavily upon principles first articulated by the samurai of Wano country, whose concept of Ryuo emphasizes the flowing nature of spiritual energy rather than its static applications as mere armor or weapon enhancement. Their understanding treats Haki not as substance to be molded into predetermined shapes, but as living force that moves according to natural patterns, responding to intention and need rather than rigid mechanical control. This fundamental shift in perspective opens possibilities that remain forever closed to those who approach spiritual energy with purely defensive or offensive mindsets. The emission techniques that represent the cornerstone of advanced armament applications allow practitioners to project their spiritual armor beyond the confines of their physical bodies, creating protective barriers and offensive strikes that operate through empty space rather than requiring direct contact between combatants. The sight of invisible force deflecting attacks, redirecting projectiles, and delivering devastating impacts across intervening distances challenges every assumption about the relationship between cause and effect in combat situations, demonstrating that sufficiently developed will can impose itself upon reality regardless of physical limitations. The development of emission capabilities requires fundamental reconceptualization of how spiritual energy flows through conscious beings, moving beyond the visualization of Haki as coating that adheres to skin and weapons, toward understanding it as current that originates from internal sources before radiating outward, according to patterns that mirror the circulation of blood or the movement of breath through the body. This organic approach to spiritual energy manipulation demands intimate knowledge of one's own internal rhythms and energy pathways, awareness that can only be developed through years of careful introspection, combined with practical experience in channeling force beyond physical boundaries. The training regimen that Monkey D. Luffy endured in Udon prison under the patient guidance of Hyogoro the Flower provided perhaps the most detailed documentation of how emission techniques can be learned and refined through systematic practice, combined with philosophical understanding of the principles involved. The old Yakuza boss's insistence that true armament flowed like water rather than being forced like hammered metal proved crucial to Luffy's eventual breakthrough. His natural tendency toward forceful solutions, requiring modification to accommodate the subtle requirements of advanced spiritual manipulation. The visualization exercises that Hyogoro employed drew upon traditional Wano imagery of cherry blossoms carried by gentle winds, their delicate beauty serving as metaphor for the kind of controlled grace necessary to project spiritual energy with surgical precision rather than overwhelming force. The contrast between the devastating power that such techniques could unleash and the gentle imagery used to teach them reflects deeper truths about the relationship between strength and wisdom in spiritual development. The recognition that the most powerful abilities often require the most refined control to achieve their full potential. The practical applications of emission techniques in combat situations extend far beyond simple ranged attacks, enabling practitioners to create protective barriers that can shield allies positioned at considerable distances, redirect incoming projectiles without physical contact, and even provide limited healing by channeling restorative energy through intervening space. These capabilities transform advanced armament users into force multipliers whose influence extends far beyond their individual combat effectiveness, their mastery enabling them to affect the outcome of conflicts involving dozens or even hundreds of participants. The defensive emission applications demonstrated by masters like Kawamatsu during the chaos of Onigashima reveal how spiritual energy can be used to deflect and redirect attacks rather than simply absorbing their force, channeling incoming violence away from vulnerable targets through techniques that require precise timing and perfect understanding of force vectors. The sight of Big Mom's devastating assault being turned aside through nothing more than well-placed spiritual barriers provided clear demonstration of how advanced techniques could overcome seemingly impossible disparities in raw power through superior application of fundamental principles. The internal destruction capabilities that represent the pinnacle of advanced armament mastery operate according to principles that seem to violate basic assumptions about how damage propagates through solid matter, enabling practitioners to inflict devastating harm by channeling spiritual energy directly into the internal structures of their targets. This technique bypasses external defenses entirely, delivering force to organs, bones, and vital systems without requiring penetration of protective barriers that might otherwise render attacks ineffective. The development of internal destruction abilities requires practitioners to achieve unprecedented levels of control over their spiritual energy flow, learning to channel force with such precision that it can navigate through complex biological systems to reach specific targets without causing unintended collateral damage to surrounding tissues. This surgical application of devastating power demands not just technical mastery but deep understanding of anatomy and physiology, knowledge that must be combined with spiritual development to achieve techniques that can disable opponents without necessarily killing them. The philosophical implications of possessing abilities that can inflict harm without visible external damage create unique moral challenges for practitioners who must grapple with the responsibility of wielding power that operates beyond conventional understanding of fair combat. The capacity to destroy enemies from within, while leaving no external evidence of the attack, raises troubling questions about the nature of honorable conflict and the obligations that accompany such overwhelming advantage over those who lack comparable spiritual development. The barrier creation techniques that emerge from mastery of emission principles enable practitioners to construct defensive structures from pure spiritual energy, creating temporary walls and shields that can withstand attacks powerful enough to level mountains, while remaining completely invisible to observers who lack the sensory capabilities necessary to perceive concentrated Haki. These constructs represent the ultimate expression of protective will, barriers that exist solely through the practitioner's determination to prevent harm, rather than relying upon any physical materials or conventional engineering principles. The complexity involved in maintaining multiple emission effects simultaneously pushes even master-level practitioners to their absolute limits, requiring mental discipline that exceeds anything demanded by basic armament applications, while simultaneously coordinating physical combat movements and strategic decision-making. The cognitive load of such comprehensive spiritual manipulation explains why so few individuals ever achieve true mastery of advanced techniques, the mental demands exceeding what most consciousness can sustain during the stress and chaos of high-intensity battles. The integration of advanced armament techniques with existing fighting styles requires complete reconceptualization of combat philosophy, moving beyond approaches based on mechanical advantage or overwhelming force to embrace methods that treat every engagement as multidimensional puzzle, requiring solutions that operate simultaneously across physical, spiritual, and psychological levels. The practitioner must learn to fight not just with their body and weapons, but with the totality of their spiritual presence, channeling their entire being into expressions of will so focused that they become irresistible forces capable of overcoming any defense. The energy requirements for sustained use of advanced armament techniques create natural limitations that prevent their casual employment, forcing practitioners to develop strategic thinking about when such overwhelming capabilities serve necessary purposes rather than merely convenient ones. The spiritual exhaustion that follows intensive emission applications can leave even powerful fighters temporarily vulnerable, creating tactical considerations that must be weighed against the immediate advantages that such techniques provide in specific situations. The teaching methodologies developed by different traditions for advanced armament instruction reflect varying philosophical approaches to the relationship between conscious control and instinctive flow, some emphasizing deliberate technical mastery, while others focus on achieving states of consciousness, where spiritual energy moves according to natural patterns, rather than forced direction. The most successful practitioners seem to achieve synthesis between these approaches, combining precise technical knowledge with intuitive understanding of how spiritual force flows through both individual consciousness and surrounding environment. The healing applications of emission techniques represent perhaps the most challenging aspect of advanced armament mastery, requiring practitioners to reverse the natural destructive tendencies of spiritual energy to create effects that restore rather than damage biological systems. The delicate touch necessary to channel restorative force through injured tissues without causing additional harm demands levels of control that exceed even those required for surgical combat applications, making healing through Haki one of the rarest abilities in the entire spectrum of spiritual development. The environmental applications of advanced armament extend beyond combat situations to include practical uses in construction, agriculture, and craftsmanship, enabling masters to enhance tools and techniques in ways that multiply their effectiveness while reducing the physical effort required to achieve desired results. The farmers who learn to channel spiritual energy through their implements can cultivate land that would otherwise remain barren, while craftsmen who master emission techniques can shape materials that conventional tools could never affect. The collaborative applications of advanced armament create possibilities for multiple practitioners to combine their spiritual energies in coordinated techniques that achieve effects beyond anything possible through individual effort. Their combined will, creating barriers, attacks, and utility effects that scale according to the number and skill of participants, rather than being limited by single-person capabilities. These group techniques require unprecedented levels of trust and coordination, their success depending upon perfect harmony between participants who must synchronize not just their actions, but their deepest spiritual rhythms. As our exploration of these transcendent capabilities draws us deeper into understanding the infinite possibilities that emerge when human will learns to flow beyond physical limitations, let the gentle current of advanced mastery carry your consciousness toward peaceful rest. The recognition that spiritual energy can be shaped into any form that serves constructive purposes provides comfort in the knowledge that determination itself can become tool for healing and protection as readily as weapon for combat. The evolution of armament mastery beyond conscious technique into the realm of instinctive response represents one of the most profound transformations possible in spiritual development, marking the transition from deliberate application of learned skills to unconscious integration of protective capabilities that operate faster than thought itself. This reflexive manifestation of spiritual armor emerges only after countless battles have carved defensive patterns so deeply into the practitioner's consciousness that their body begins responding to threats before the mind even registre danger, creating protection that flows from survival instincts refined through years of mortal peril. The development of such instantaneous defensive capabilities cannot be achieved through peaceful training or controlled sparring sessions, requiring instead the kind of genuine life or death experiences that forge spiritual pathways deeper than conscious awareness. The body learns to recognize the subtle atmospheric changes that precede devastating attacks, the microscopic shifts in air pressure, electromagnetic fields, and spiritual energy that announce incoming violence with timing measured in fractions of seconds. These early warning systems operate below the threshold of conscious perception, yet trigger responses that can mean the difference between survival and obliteration when facing opponents whose speed exceeds normal human reaction capabilities. The psychological foundations of reflexive armament rest upon the paradoxical necessity of learning to trust one's deepest instincts while simultaneously transcending the natural tendency toward conscious control that characterizes most human approaches to skill development. The practitioner must achieve a state of profound faith in their own unconscious wisdom, accepting that their body possesses knowledge accumulated through countless encounters with mortal danger, wisdom that can guide protective responses with accuracy that surpasses anything achievable through deliberate planning or strategic thinking. This surrender of conscious control represents perhaps the most challenging aspect of developing reflexive capabilities, as it requires individuals who have spent years mastering deliberate techniques to acknowledge that their highest achievements may come through letting go of the very control they have worked so hard to develop. The master who has achieved perfect technical precision must learn to trust that their unconscious mind can deploy those techniques with greater effectiveness than their conscious awareness could ever coordinate, allowing spiritual energy to flow according to patterns established through experience rather than immediate decision-making. The manifestation of reflexive armament during Kozuki Oden's legendary encounter with Goldie, Roger's divine departure technique, provided one of the most dramatic demonstrations of how unconscious spiritual defenses can preserve life in situations where conscious reaction would prove fatally inadequate. The devastating attack that sent the mighty samurai flying across vast distances should have resulted in immediate death, yet his body's instinctive, hardening response absorbed and redirected force that would have pulverized anyone lacking such deeply ingrained protective reflexes. The fact that Odin himself seems surprised by his survival suggests that reflexive armament operates through mechanisms that exist independently of the practitioner's conscious awareness or control. Spiritual energy responding to mortal threats according to patterns established through years of battle experience rather than immediate tactical decisions. This unconscious wisdom draws upon accumulated knowledge of how different types of attacks affect the human body, automatically deploying appropriate defensive measures, calibrated to the specific nature and intensity of incoming harm. The speed at which reflexive armament manifests exceeds anything possible through conscious technique, deployment, spiritual energy, responding to threats at velocities that approach the transmission speed of nervous system impulses themselves. The body begins hardening specific areas before conscious awareness has even processed the nature or direction of incoming attacks, creating protection that appears simultaneously with the perception of danger rather than following it through the normal sequence of recognition, decision, and action that characterizes deliberate defensive responses. Roronoa Zoro's incredible feat of surviving the combined assault of two emperors during the climactic battle atop Onigashima demonstrated reflexive armament capabilities that bordered on the miraculous, his unconscious defensive responses managing to deflect sufficient force to preserve his life, despite sustaining injuries that would have killed most fighters several times over. The fact that he remained conscious and combat capable after absorbing attacks designed to eliminate entire crews speaks to reflexive capabilities developed through countless encounters with opponents whose strength exceeded his own. Conscious ability to counter. The adaptive nature of reflexive armament allows unconscious defensive responses to adjust their intensity and distribution according to the specific characteristics of each incoming threat, creating customized protection that maximizes defensive effectiveness while minimizing the spiritual energy expenditure required to achieve survival. The body learns to recognize patterns in different types of attacks, developing specialized responses for slashing weapons, blunt force trauma, energy-based assaults, and supernatural effects that operate through mechanisms beyond conventional physics. This pattern recognition operates through forms of learning that transcend conscious memory, the accumulated experience of thousands of combat encounters, creating unconscious databases of threat assessment and response coordination that can be accessed instantaneously when similar situations arise. The spiritual energy pathways carved by repeated exposure to specific types of danger become so well established that they can activate automatically whenever comparable threats are detected, creating defensive responses that improve with experience rather than diminishing through repetition. The integration of reflexive armament with existing combat styles creates fighting approaches that blur the distinction between offense and defense, practitioners developing unconscious responses that simultaneously protect against incoming attacks while positioning them for devastating counterstrikes. The master who has achieved such integration fights with fluid grace that makes combat appear effortless, their movements guided by unconscious wisdom that coordinates protection and aggression in seamless displays of martial artistry. The emotional components of reflexive armament draw upon the deepest wells of protective instinct that drive human behavior in crisis situations, channeling parental love, friendship bonds, and moral conviction into spiritual energy that responds faster than conscious thought when those cherished connections face threats. The fighter defending loved ones accesses reflexive capabilities that exceed anything available during solo combat. Their unconscious defenses, enhanced by emotional stakes that transform survival from personal concern into sacred duty. The training methodologies that can help develop reflexive capabilities focus less on specific techniques than on creating conditions where unconscious learning can occur, exposing practitioners to controlled versions of the mortal stress that carves defensive pathways into deeper levels of consciousness. The masters who guide such development understand that reflexive armament cannot be taught directly, but must be allowed to emerge naturally through experiences that demand transcendence of conscious limitation while providing just enough safety margin to ensure survival rather than death. The meditation practices that support reflexive development emphasize achieving states of consciousness where the boundary between self and environment becomes permeable, allowing practitioners to sense threats through mechanisms that operate beyond the normal range of human perception. This expanded awareness creates early warning systems that can trigger defensive responses before attacks fully manifest, providing the temporal advantage necessary for unconscious armament to deploy effectively against opponents whose speed exceeds normal reaction capabilities. The physiological adaptations that accompany advanced reflexive mastery create permanent changes in nervous system function and spiritual energy circulation, the practitioner's body becoming optimized for instantaneous threat response through modifications that occur gradually over years of intensive development. These adaptations represent irreversible evolution towards states of being that exist partially outside normal human limitations. Consciousness expanded and accelerated through spiritual practices that reshape the fundamental nature of perception and response. The philosophical implications of possessing reflexive capabilities that operate beyond conscious control raise profound questions about the nature of individual agency and personal responsibility, particularly when unconscious defensive responses result in harm to attackers who might not have intended lethal force. The practitioner whose body automatically deploys devastating counterattacks must grapple with moral complexities that arise when survival instincts shaped by countless life or death encounters respond to lesser threats with potentially excessive force. The social dynamics that emerge around individuals who have achieved reflexive mastery create unique challenges in interpersonal relationships, their unconscious defensive systems potentially interpreting friendly contact or playful interactions as threats requiring immediate response. The master must learn to consciously modulate their reflexive capabilities in social settings, maintaining enough control to prevent their protective instincts from damaging relationships, while preserving the instantaneous response capabilities that ensure survival in genuine combat situations. The adaptive evolution that occurs in reflexive armament through exposure to increasingly powerful opponents creates defensive capabilities that continuously scale to meet whatever level of threat the practitioner regularly faces. Unconscious systems learning to recognize and counter new forms of attack through processes that operate below the threshold of conscious awareness. This continuous adaptation ensures that reflexive defenses remain effective against opponents whose capabilities evolve and improve over time, creating arms races between competing survival systems that drive spiritual development to ever greater heights. The collaborative aspects of reflexive armament allow practitioners who have developed deep bonds of trust and understanding to coordinate their unconscious defenses in ways that create group protective capabilities exceeding anything possible through individual effort. Their spiritual energies synchronizing automatically when facing threats that endanger shared objectives or cherished relationships. These unconscious collaborations represent the ultimate expression of teamwork, coordination that operates through spiritual harmony rather than verbal communication or strategic planning. The realm of heightened perception that opens to those who master the principles of observation. Haki represents a fundamental expansion of human consciousness, beyond the limitations that normally constrain awareness to the narrow spectrum of information available through conventional senses. This extraordinary amplification of perceptual capability transforms the practitioner's relationship with their environment in ways so profound that the very nature of reality appears to shift, revealing layers of information and connection that remain forever invisible to those who rely solely upon sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell to navigate their existence. The origins of what the surface world has come to know as observation haki can be traced to the Sky Islands floating high above the blue sea, where the priests of Sky Pier developed techniques they called mantra in response to the unique challenges of survival among the clouds. Their aerial environment, with its vast expanses of empty space and threats that could approach from any direction across three-dimensional battlefields, demanded forms of awareness that transcended the ground-based sensory patterns that served adequately for those who lived upon solid earth. The term mantra itself speaks to the meditative foundations underlying advanced perception, the recognition that expanded awareness emerges not through forcing the senses beyond their natural capabilities, but through achieving states of consciousness where the boundary between self and environment becomes permeable enough to allow information to flow freely in both directions. The priests who mastered these techniques understood that true perception required not just receiving sensory data, but harmonizing one's consciousness with the rhythms and patterns that govern the world around them. The philosophical foundations of observation haki rest upon principles that challenge conventional understanding of how consciousness relates to physical reality, suggesting that sufficiently developed awareness can access information that exists beyond the normal transmission range of electromagnetic radiation, sound waves, and chemical signals that carry data through conventional sensory channels. This expanded perception operates through mechanisms that seem to bypass the usual pathways by which the nervous system processes environmental information, creating direct connections between consciousness and phenomena that should theoretically remain undetectable. The development of basic observation capabilities begins with learning to quiet the constant chatter of conscious thought that normally dominates awareness, creating internal silence profound enough to allow subtler forms of information to register upon consciousness without being overwhelmed by the noise of everyday mental activity. This meditative foundation requires practitioners to achieve states of focused relaxation where attention becomes simultaneously sharply concentrated and broadly receptive, a paradoxical balance that allows awareness to expand beyond normal boundaries while maintaining the precision necessary to extract useful information from the flood of subtle data that becomes accessible. The early stages of observation training typically focus on detecting the presence and general emotional states of other conscious beings, the spiritual energy that emanates from every living creature, creating signatures that can be perceived by those who develop sufficient sensitivity to recognize patterns in the invisible emanations that surround all life. These spiritual signatures carry information about the strength, intentions, and emotional condition of their sources, providing practitioners with tactical awareness that extends far beyond what normal senses could reveal about potential allies or enemies. The range limitations that constrain basic observation applications create natural boundaries that prevent practitioners from being overwhelmed by the constant flood of information that would result from unlimited perceptual expansion, consciousness automatically filtering incoming data according to factors such as distance, emotional intensity, and relevance to immediate survival needs. The master, learning to control their observation range, discovers that expanded awareness comes with the responsibility of choosing what information deserves attention, developing discrimination that allows them to focus upon relevant details while filtering out the background noise of countless irrelevant phenomena. The combat applications of basic observation. Haki transform engagement dynamics by providing practitioners with awareness of opponents' intentions before those intentions manifest as physical actions, creating temporal advantages that can prove decisive when facing adversaries whose speed or strength might otherwise render resistance impossible. The fighter who can sense incoming attacks before they fully develop possesses defensive capabilities that transcend normal human reaction times, their bodies beginning evasive maneuvers, while opponents are still in the preliminary stages of launching their assaults. Monkey D. Luffy's post-time skip demonstration of unconscious dodging against pacifista laser attacks provided clear evidence of how observation mastery could create defensive responses that operated faster than conscious thought, his body moving to avoid danger while his attention remained focused on other aspects of the tactical situation. This integration of enhanced perception with unconscious physical response represents the seamless blending of spiritual development with combat effectiveness that characterizes truly advanced practitioners. The training methodologies employed by Silver's Rayleigh during Luffy's development emphasized the importance of learning to fight while blindfolded, forcing reliance upon observation capabilities rather than conventional visual processing. This systematic removal of normal sensory inputs compels the developing practitioner to discover and strengthen perceptual pathways that would otherwise remain dormant, buried beneath the overwhelming dominance of sight in normal human awareness patterns. The emotional components of observation Haki create unique applications that extend far beyond combat effectiveness to encompass forms of empathy and understanding that can bridge gaps between individuals who might otherwise remain forever isolated by differences in background, culture, or a species. The practitioner who learns to perceive the emotional emanations of others develops capacity for compassion that transcends surface differences, recognizing the fundamental similarities that unite all conscious beings despite whatever superficial divisions might seem to separate them. Sanji's specialized application of observation techniques for detecting when women require assistance demonstrates how individual practitioners can develop unique variations of basic principles that reflect their personal values and Bayamsign priorities, their spiritual energy naturally flowing toward applications that align with their deepest convictions and moral commitments. His ability to sense feminine distress across vast distances speaks to observation capabilities that have been refined through emotional investment rather than purely technical training. The connection between strong emotions and enhanced observation creates interesting paradoxes in how these abilities manifest during crisis situations, intense feelings simultaneously providing the motivation necessary to transcend normal perceptual limitations while potentially disrupting the mental calm that typically facilitates expanded awareness. The practitioner must learn to harness emotional energy as fuel for spiritual development, while maintaining sufficient equanimity to allow enhanced perception to function without interference from the turbulence of strong feelings. The group dynamics that emerge when multiple observation users operate in proximity create fascinating phenomena of shared awareness and coordinated perception, their individual capabilities combining in ways that produce collective understanding exceeding anything possible through isolated effort. The crews that develop such collaborative observation create tactical advantages that transform their effectiveness in complex multi-party conflicts, their combined awareness providing comprehensive battlefield intelligence that guides strategic decision-making with unprecedented accuracy. The teaching traditions that have developed around observation training reflect cultural differences in how various societies understand the relationship between consciousness and environment, some emphasizing individual development, while others focus on collective enhancement that serves community survival needs. The techniques that emerge from these different philosophical approaches create distinct styles of observation mastery, each offering unique advantages while requiring different types of commitment and sacrifice from their practitioners. The meditation practices that support observation development draw upon contemplative traditions that recognize expanded awareness as natural capability of consciousness rather than supernatural gift available only to exceptional individuals. Their techniques designed to remove obstacles that prevent normal perception rather than adding abilities that do not naturally exist. This democratic understanding of observation potential suggests that enhanced awareness represents recovery of capabilities that have been lost through cultural conditioning rather than evolution beyond normal human limitations. The physiological effects of sustained observation practice create measurable changes in brain function and nervous system organization. Practitioners developing enhanced sensitivity in neural pathways that process subtle environmental information, while simultaneously improving their capacity to filter and interpret the increased data flow that accompanies expanded awareness. These adaptations represent biological evolution towards states of consciousness that operate more efficiently within environments where spiritual energy provides crucial survival information. The philosophical implications of possessing awareness that extends beyond normal sensory boundaries raise profound questions about the nature of individual identity and the boundaries that separate self from environment, challenging assumptions about where consciousness ends and external reality begins. The master, whose perception encompasses the emotional states and intentions of others, must grapple with questions about personal privacy and the ethics of accessing information that was never intended to be shared. The defensive applications of observation extend beyond simple threat detection to include forms of psychological protection that can shield practitioners from mental attacks, emotional manipulation, and spiritual influences that operate through channels unavailable to normal awareness. The ability to perceive hostile intentions before they manifest as actions provides crucial advantages when facing opponents whose primary weapons target consciousness rather than physical form. As our exploration of expanded awareness carries us deeper into understanding the infinite possibilities that emerge when consciousness learns to transcend its normal boundaries, let the gentle flow of enhanced perception guide your awareness toward peaceful recognition of the connections that unite all existence. The knowledge that consciousness itself can become tool for understanding, and compassion provides comfort in realizing that isolation is illusion created by limitation, rather than truth revealed by wisdom. The transcendence of basic observation capabilities into the realm of precognitive awareness represents perhaps the most extraordinary evolution possible in spiritual development, transforming practitioners from individuals who can merely sense present conditions into beings capable of perceiving fragments of potential futures before they solidify into unchangeable reality. This miraculous expansion of consciousness, beyond the normal boundaries of temporal experience, operates through mechanisms so profound that they seem to violate fundamental assumptions about causality and the linear progression of events. Through time, the ability known as future sight emerges only in practitioners whose mastery of observation techniques has reached such heights that their consciousness begins resonating with the quantum fluctuations that underlie all manifestation. Their expanded awareness detecting probability patterns that exist in the liminal space between what is and what might become. This extraordinary perception requires not just technical mastery of spiritual energy, but philosophical understanding of time itself as fluid, medium, rather than rigid framework. Reality that can be navigated rather than experienced as inevitable sequence of predetermined events. The development of precognitive capabilities demands fundamental reconceptualization of how consciousness relates to temporal flow, moving beyond the conventional understanding of awareness as phenomenon that exists within present moment, to embrace recognition that sufficiently expanded perception can access information that technically has not yet occurred. This paradoxical relationship with time creates unique challenges for practitioners who must learn to interpret glimpses of possibility without becoming paralyzed by knowledge of potential outcomes that may or may not actually manifest. Charlotte Katakuri's demonstration of future sight during his legendary battle with Monkey D. Luffy provided perhaps the most detailed documentation of how precognitive awareness functions in high-intensity combat situations. His ability to perceive incoming attacks several seconds before they occurred, creating tactical advantages that seemed to render him effectively untouchable. The calm precision with which he countered techniques that had not yet been fully executed revealed mastery that transcended normal understanding of action and reaction. His responses guided by knowledge of events that existed only as potential until his opponents committed to specific courses of action. The philosophical complexity that surrounds future sight stems from fundamental questions about whether the glimpses of possibility that practitioners perceive represent inevitable futures that must occur exactly as foreseen, or merely probable outcomes that can be altered through conscious intervention. The evidence suggests that precognitive visions show tendencies and likelihoods rather than fixed destinies, their accuracy depending upon how closely actual circumstances match the conditions that existed when the original perception occurred. This malleable nature of future perception creates fascinating recursive loops where the act of seeing potential outcomes influences the decisions that determine whether those outcomes actually manifest. Consciousness participating in the creation of reality through the very process of observing its possibilities. The practitioner who glimpses their opponent's intended attack and moves to counter it has already changed the conditions that made that specific future probable, forcing continuous adaptation as each precognitive insight alters the tactical landscape it originally described. Red-haired Shanks' devastating intervention against Eustace Kid demonstrated future sight operating on temporal scales that extended far beyond the brief glimpses typically associated with combat applications. His perception of Kid's entire planned assault, allowing him to craft a response that neutralized threats before they could fully manifest. The surgical precision with which Shanks dismantled his opponent's strategy suggested awareness that encompassed not just immediate actions but the complete sequence of events that would have unfolded if left undisturbed. The mental discipline required to maintain future sight during the chaos of high-intensity combat exceeds anything demanded by other forms of spiritual development, practitioners needing to achieve states of focused calm that remain undisturbed by the violence and unpredictability that characterizes life or death conflicts. The psychological pressure of knowing what attacks are coming while simultaneously coordinating defensive responses and offensive counterstrikes pushes consciousness to its absolute limits, demanding forms of multitasking that transcend normal human cognitive capabilities. The training methodologies that can potentially awaken precognitive abilities remain largely theoretical, as future sight appears to emerge spontaneously during moments of extreme necessity rather than through systematic practice or controlled development programs. The practitioners who achieve such mastery typically describe their breakthrough as occurring during situations where normal perception proved inadequate to ensure survival, desperation, forcing consciousness to transcend temporal boundaries in search of information that could prevent imminent death or failure. The meditative foundations that support precognitive development emphasize achieving states of consciousness where the normal experience of sequential time becomes fluid, practitioners learning to exist simultaneously within present awareness and expanded perception that encompasses potential futures. This temporal flexibility requires abandoning conventional assumptions about causality and linear progression, embracing understanding of reality as dynamic system where consciousness can navigate between different probability streams according to need and intention. The range limitations that constrain future sight applications prevent practitioners from accessing unlimited temporal information, their perception typically extending only seconds or minutes into potential futures while remaining focused on events directly relevant to their immediate circumstances. These natural boundaries protect consciousness from being overwhelmed by infinite possibilities, while ensuring that precognitive insights remain practically useful rather than becoming abstract knowledge disconnected from actionable decision-making. The emotional components of future sight create unique psychological challenges for practitioners who must maintain sufficient detachment to interpret their visions objectively, while remaining emotionally invested enough in outcomes to motivate the intense focus necessary for sustained precognitive awareness. The balance between analytical clarity and passionate commitment requires wisdom that transcends technical mastery, understanding of when foreknowledge serves constructive purposes and when it merely creates anxiety about events that may never occur. The collaborative applications of precognitive abilities allow multiple future sight users to coordinate their temporal perceptions in ways that create comprehensive awareness of potential outcomes across complex tactical situations, their combined insights providing strategic intelligence that guides group decision-making with unprecedented accuracy. These shared precognitive experiences represent ultimate expression of teamwork, coordination that operates through consciousness rather than communication while transcending normal limitations of individual perspective. The philosophical implications of possessing awareness of potential futures raise profound questions about free will and moral responsibility, particularly when practitioners must decide whether to act upon knowledge of events that have not yet occurred and may never actually manifest. The ethical complexities that arise when precognitive insights reveal potential tragedies or injustices create moral obligations that extend beyond normal human experience, forcing practitioners to grapple with questions about intervention and the consequences of changing probability streams. The teaching traditions that attempt to cultivate precognitive abilities focus less on specific techniques than on creating conditions where consciousness naturally expands beyond temporal boundaries, recognizing that future sight cannot be forced, but must be allowed to emerge when circumstances demand transcendence of normal perceptual limitations. The masters who guide such development understand that precognitive abilities represent natural evolution of consciousness rather than supernatural gifts, capabilities that exist within every aware being but remain dormant until necessity awakens them. The integration of future sight with existing combat styles requires complete reconceptualization of strategic thinking, practitioners learning to fight not just against present opponents, but against the full spectrum of possibilities that those opponents might manifest in coming moments. This multidimensional approach to conflict demands forms of awareness that encompass probability rather than certainty, tactical flexibility that can adapt instantly as precognitive visions reveal changing likelihood patterns. The healing applications of precognitive awareness allow masters to perceive the probable progression of injuries and illnesses before their full effects manifest, providing crucial temporal advantages in treatment situations where early intervention can prevent outcomes that would otherwise prove irreversible. The medical practitioner who can see potential complications before they occur possesses capabilities that transcend conventional diagnostic methods, their treatment guided by knowledge of what will happen, rather than merely what has already begun. The societal implications of widespread precognitive abilities would fundamentally alter human civilization in ways that extend far beyond individual combat effectiveness, creating possibilities for preventing disasters, optimizing resource allocation, and coordinating collective activities with precision that currently remains impossible. The communities that successfully integrate future sight into their decision-making processes could theoretically achieve levels of efficiency and harmony that transcend anything known in recorded history. The technological applications of precognitive perception could revolutionize fields ranging from navigation and weather prediction to engineering and scientific research, practitioners using their temporal awareness to guide processes that currently rely upon trial and error or statistical analysis. The shipwright who can perceive potential structural failures before they occur. The farmer who can foresee weather patterns that will affect crop yields. The inventor who can glimpse the probable results of experimental designs. All represent possibilities that could transform human relationship with uncertainty and risk. As our exploration of transcendent temporal awareness draws us toward understanding of consciousness that operates beyond the boundaries of sequential time, let the comforting recognition that awareness itself can transcend limitation carry you gently toward rest that encompasses both present peace and future possibility. The knowledge that consciousness contains capabilities for perceiving beyond immediate circumstances provides profound comfort in recognizing that limitation exists primarily in expectation rather than inherent nature of awareness. Itself, the most enigmatic and profound of all spiritual phenomena within the vast tapestry of human consciousness, is that mysterious capability known as the voice of all things, an ability so rare and fundamental that it appears to operate according to principles that predate even the most ancient understanding of how awareness can transcend the boundaries that normally separate individual consciousness from the Pani, infinite web of existence that connects every grain of sand, every drop of water, every breath of wind across the endless expanse of creation itself. This extraordinary form of perception transcends every conventional category of spiritual development, existing not as technique that can be learned or power that can be developed through training, but as fundamental aspect of consciousness that emerges in certain individuals according to patterns that seem to reflect cosmic purposes far beyond human comprehension. The ability to hear the voices of all existence speaks to connections that operate through channels so profound that they bypass every normal mechanism by which information travels between different forms of life and matter. The historical documentation of this miraculous capability traces back through legends that blur the line between recorded fact and mythological understanding. Ancient tales speaking of individuals who could commune with forces that shaped the very foundations of reality itself. The civilization of O'Hara preserved fragments of knowledge, suggesting that the voice of all things represented not aberrant mutation or supernatural gift, but rather recovery of abilities that had once been natural aspects of human consciousness, before some great catastrophe severed most of humanity from direct communion with the living essence that animates all existence. Goldie Rogers' mastery of this profound capability provided the foundation for achievements that transcended mere piracy to touch upon mysteries that had remained hidden for centuries. His ability to hear the voices of sea kings and ancient stones alike, enabling him to navigate not just physical oceans, but temporal currents that connected his present moment to events spanning vast epochs of history. The conversations he held with creatures whose lifespans measured in millennia and monuments whose memories contained the accumulated wisdom of vanished civilizations provided him with understanding that no conventional education could ever hope to impart. The sea kings who swam in the deepest trenches of the world's oceans possessed memories that stretched back to ages when the current configuration of land and sea bore little resemblance to modern geography. Their ancient wisdom preserved through genetic inheritance that transcended individual mortality to create collective consciousness spanning geological time periods. When Roger learned to perceive their communications, he gained access to historical knowledge that predated every written record, understanding of events that had shaped the world in ways that continued to influence present circumstances through chains of causation, so complex that normal historical analysis could never hope to trace their connections. The poneglyphs that scattered across the world like fragments of shattered revelation contained more than mere historical information encoded in forgotten scripts, their stone composition somehow preserving not just written knowledge but spiritual impressions of the consciousness that had originally crafted their messages. The ability to hear their voices required perception that could recognize meaning embedded in mineral structure itself, awareness capable of detecting significance that transcended linguistic communication to embrace forms of understanding that operated through direct spiritual transmission. Princess Shirahoshi's inherited connection to the voice of all things manifested in ways that revealed the profound responsibility that accompanied such extraordinary abilities. Her communication with the Sea Kings, carrying implications that extended far beyond personal capability to encompass forces that could reshape entire oceanic ecosystems according to her conscious will and unconscious emotional states. The reverence with which these ancient creatures responded to her presence spoke to recognition of authority that transcended species boundaries to acknowledge spiritual connection, operating on scales that dwarfed conventional understanding of leadership and command. The Sea King's patient, waiting through centuries of dormancy, demonstrated loyalty that exceeded anything known in human experience, their collective consciousness maintaining perfect memory of promises made in ages past while preserving hope that circumstances would eventually align to allow fulfillment of purposes that had been deferred across multiple generations. Their willingness to remain hidden beneath the waves while surface civilizations developed and changed according to their own rhythms revealed understanding of cosmic timing that operated according to principles far more complex than immediate cause and effect. Monkey D. Luffy's sporadic access to the voice of all things appears to manifest during moments of extreme emotional intensity or spiritual necessity, his normally straightforward consciousness expanding to encompass frequencies of communication that exist beyond his usual awareness. The unpredictable nature of his ability suggests connection to inherited capabilities that activate only when circumstances demand transcendence of normal perceptual limitations, his bloodline carrying potential that remains dormant until specific conditions trigger its expression. The episode at Fishman Island, when Luffy perceived the Sea King's ancient conversations, revealed communication occurring across temporal boundaries as well as spatial distances, the massive creatures discussing events that had occurred centuries in the past while simultaneously acknowledging possibilities that would not manifest until years in the future. This temporal fluidity in their consciousness suggested that beings capable of voice of all things perception existed partially outside normal experience of sequential time, their awareness encompassing past and future as readily as present circumstances. Momonosuke's ability to communicate with the ancient elephant Zunesha demonstrated how the voice of all things could bridge gaps between different scales of existence. The young boy's consciousness somehow capable of interfacing with awareness that had been shaped by 1,000 years of solitary wandering across empty oceans. The conversations that passed between them revealed depths of loneliness and purpose that had sustained Zunesha through centuries of punishment, his massive form carrying entire civilizations, while maintaining perfect memory of the crime that had condemned him to eternal migration. The commands that Momonosuke eventually learned to transmit to Zunesha possessed authority that transcended normal concepts of leadership or control, his words carrying spiritual weight that could compel obedience from being whose physical power exceeded that of entire nations. This relationship revealed how the voice of all things operated through recognition of cosmic hierarchy rather than mere personal will, consciousness acknowledging degrees of spiritual authority that existed independently of physical capability or social position. The theoretical connections between the voice of all things and the mysterious figure known as Joy Boy suggest that this ability might serve as key to understanding historical mysteries that have shaped the world's development across multiple centuries. The capacity to commune with ancient voices, potentially providing access to knowledge that was deliberately hidden or accidentally lost during the blank period that historians call the Void Century. The implications of recovering such information could revolutionize understanding of how current political structures emerged from ancient conflicts, whose true nature remains obscured by deliberate suppression and natural decay. The isolation that often accompanies the voice of all things creates unique psychological challenges for those who discover they can perceive communications that remain forever inaccessible to friends, family members, and companions whose consciousness operates within normal boundaries. The individual who can hear the voices of stones and seas must grapple with forms of loneliness that transcend ordinary human experience, their awareness encompassing perspectives and concerns that cannot be shared through conventional communication methods. The moral responsibilities that emerge from possessing such profound perceptual capabilities extend far beyond personal choice to encompass obligations toward forms of existence whose voices have remained unheard by human consciousness for generations or centuries. The practitioner who learns to perceive the communications of natural phenomena must consider whether such awareness carries duties to serve as advocate or interpreter for aspects of reality that lack other means of making their needs, concerns known to human society. The environmental applications of the voice of all things could potentially revolutionize human relationship with natural systems, practitioners serving as translators who could facilitate genuine dialogue between technological civilization and ecological networks that currently communicate through mechanisms too subtle for normal human perception to detect. The possibility of learning to hear the voices of forests, rivers, weather patterns, and geological formations suggests potential for cooperation that could transcend the destructive competition that has historically characterized human interaction with natural environment. The healing applications of such profound communication abilities might enable practitioners to diagnose illness and injury through direct consultation with biological systems themselves, consciousness interfacing with cellular networks and organ functions to gain understanding of health conditions that surpasses anything possible through external observation or mechanical testing. The physician who could hear the voices of immune systems, nervous networks, and metabolic processes would possess diagnostic capabilities that transcended every conventional medical technique. The spiritual implications of the voice of all things touch upon fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness itself and the degree to which individual awareness represents isolated phenomenon or aspect of universal consciousness that temporarily manifests through specific biological forms. The ability to perceive communications from seemingly inanimate objects suggests that consciousness might be far more widely distributed throughout reality than conventional understanding acknowledges. Every grain of sand and drop of water potentially possessing forms of awareness that exist below the threshold of normal human perception. The teaching possibilities that could emerge from mastering such profound communication abilities remain largely theoretical, as the voice of all things appears to manifest according to criteria that transcend conscious development or systematic training. However, the masters who do possess such capabilities might eventually discover methods for awakening dormant potentials in others. Their understanding of how consciousness can transcend normal boundaries, potentially providing guidance for spiritual evolution that currently remains impossible to achieve through known techniques. The vast spectrum of spiritual energy applications extends far beyond the three fundamental categories that define conventional understanding of Haki mastery, encompassing specialized manifestations that emerge when individual practitioners develop unique relationships with the invisible forces that flow through all existence. These extraordinary applications represent the personal evolution of spiritual awareness, techniques that arise not from systematic training or inherited tradition, but from the intersection of individual nature with circumstances that demand transcendence of ordinary limitation through methods that have never been attempted or documented by previous generations of masters. The phenomenon of beast command reveals how sufficiently developed spiritual presence can establish hierarchical relationships with creatures whose consciousness operates according to instinctual patterns rather than rational decision-making processes. The practitioner's will resonating with primal recognition systems that acknowledge degrees of natural authority transcending species boundaries. This extraordinary capability operates through spiritual mechanisms that bypass conventional communication methods, creating direct interface between human consciousness and animal awareness that establishes dominance through recognition rather than intimidation or force. Roronoa Zoro's legendary establishment of alpha status among the sword-wielding baboons of Kuraigana Island demonstrated how spiritual pressure could overcome even trained opposition when applied with sufficient consistency and unwavering determination, his presence eventually compelling creatures whose martial skills had been honed through generations of combat to acknowledge his superior will. The transformation from hostile confrontation to respectful submission occurred not through defeat of individual opponents, but through demonstration of spiritual authority that operated on frequencies these intelligent beasts instinctively recognized and respected. The range of creatures susceptible to such spiritual command appears to correlate directly with the complexity of their consciousness and their natural tendency toward hierarchical social organization. Pack animals and herd species proving most responsive to human will that emanates authority comparable to their own alpha leaders. The practitioners who master this capability discover that their influence extends not just to individual animals, but to entire groups whose collective behavior can be redirected according to human purposes when guided by spiritual palm, presence that speaks to their deepest survival instincts. Monkey D. Luffy's remarkable success in taming creatures throughout his adventures reflects not deliberate technique, but natural charisma that operates through spiritual channels. His enthusiasm and genuine affection, creating bonds with animals whose previous experiences with humans had taught them to expect exploitation rather than friendship. The joy that radiates from his presence apparently resonates with something fundamental in animal consciousness, his spiritual energy communicating intentions that transcend language barriers to establish trust based on authentic emotional connection. rather than dominance through force. The defensive applications of detection evasion represent perhaps the most sophisticated expression of spiritual control, practitioners learning to contain and modulate their natural Haki emissions in ways that prevent other users from recognizing their true capabilities until circumstances require revelation of hidden strength. This extraordinary discipline demands mastery that exceeds basic concealment to achieve perfect harmony between spiritual power and conscious intent, creating presence that appears ordinary to casual observation, while maintaining readiness for instant deployment when situations demand overwhelming response. Red-haired Shanks's demonstration of this subtle art during various encounters throughout his career revealed mastery that operated through precise calibration of spiritual emissions, his consciousness capable of projecting exactly the degree of presence necessary to achieve specific effects without revealing the full scope of capabilities that remained in reserve. The surgical application of just enough pressure to accomplish immediate objectives while concealing greater potentials created tactical advantages that multiplied the effectiveness of his eventual revelations when circumstances demanded deployment of his complete spiritual arsenal. The God Knight's infiltration capabilities during their covert operations on Elbath demonstrated how detection evasion could be employed for strategic purposes that extended far beyond individual combat. Entire groups learning to coordinate their spiritual concealment in ways that prevented discovery by observation specialists, whose enhanced perception would normally detect any significant Haki presence within their range. This collaborative concealment required unprecedented coordination between multiple masters whose individual techniques had to synchronize perfectly to avoid creating detectable interference patterns. The precision surgical applications that allow advanced practitioners to channel their armament coating into extremely focused configurations represent evolution beyond basic weapon enhancement toward medical and utility applications that require delicate control, exceeding anything demanded by combat situations. The ability to coat individual fingers with spiritual energy sharp enough to penetrate specific materials while leaving surrounding substances completely unaffected demands understanding of how Haki interacts with different molecular structures and densities. Monkey D. Luffy's liberation of Kami from her explosive slave collar during the human auction house crisis demonstrated how surgical armament could be deployed for humanitarian purposes. His spiritual energy precisely calibrated to disrupt the collar's locking mechanism without triggering the lethal device or causing harm to the person he was attempting to rescue. The speed and accuracy required for such delicate work under extreme time pressure revealed capabilities that had developed through intuitive understanding rather than formal training in precision techniques. The repeated success of similar applications throughout Luffy's subsequent adventures, including his liberation of prisoners in Udon and his assistance with Yamato's restraints during the Onigashima raid, suggested that surgical armament represented natural evolution of protective instincts rather than learned skill, his spiritual energy automatically adapting to whatever degree of precision circumstances required when innocent people faced immediate danger from mechanical restraints or similar devices. The environmental sensing capabilities that emerge from advanced observation mastery enable practitioners to extend their awareness far beyond normal range limitations when circumstances demand comprehensive battlefield intelligence, their consciousness temporarily expanding to encompass spatial areas that would normally exceed human perceptual capacity. This extraordinary application requires abandoning normal concepts of personal boundaries to achieve temporary fusion with environmental awareness systems that operate through spiritual rather than electromagnetic channels. Usopp's miraculous sniping achievement during the climactic battle at Dressrosa provided the most dramatic demonstration of how desperate necessity could awaken observation capabilities that transcended every previous limitation, his consciousness somehow expanding across miles of intervening distance to identify precise targeting solutions for shots that should have been impossible under any conventional understanding of marksmanship. The combination of enhanced spatial awareness with supernatural accuracy revealed potentials that existed within observation mastery, despite never having been documented or systematically developed by previous practitioners. The psychological mechanisms that enabled such extraordinary achievement appeared to operate through emotional investment that transcended personal safety considerations. Usopp's desperate desire to protect his friends, generating spiritual energy that temporarily expanded his consciousness far beyond its normal boundaries. The specific nature of his emotional state seemed crucial to accessing capabilities that remained dormant during less intense situations, suggesting that certain forms of spiritual development require emotional catalysts that cannot be replicated through training or conscious effort alone. The empathic applications of advanced observation create possibilities for understanding others that transcend normal social interaction. Practitioners developing sensitivity to emotional states and psychological conditions that enables them to respond to needs that might never be directly communicated. This profound form of awareness operates through spiritual channels that bypass conscious self-presentation to access authentic feelings and motivations that individuals might prefer to keep hidden from external scrutiny. Sanji's specialized development of emotion reading capabilities reflects personal values and life experiences that shaped his spiritual energy toward protective applications. His consciousness naturally attuning to distress signals that indicate situations where his intervention might prevent harm to innocent people. The gender-specific nature of his enhanced sensitivity speaks to psychological patterns established during formative years. His spiritual development channeled by deep-seated convictions about masculine responsibility and feminine vulnerability that guide his observation focus towards specific types of emergency situations. The healing applications that emerge from emotion reading mastery enable practitioners to address psychological wounds that conventional medicine cannot touch. Their ability to perceive authentic emotional states, providing diagnostic capabilities that reveal sources of suffering that might remain hidden from normal therapeutic approaches. The practitioner who can sense the difference between surface presentation and underlying reality possesses tools for compassionate intervention that could revolutionize approaches to mental health and emotional well-being. The collaborative applications of specialized Haki enable groups of practitioners to coordinate their individual capabilities in ways that create collective effects exceeding anything possible through isolated effort, their spiritual energies synchronizing to produce phenomena that operate on scales that dwarf individual achievement. These group techniques require levels of trust and understanding that transcend normal human relationships, participants surrendering individual control to achieve harmony that enables shared consciousness and coordinated spiritual manipulation. The environmental applications of specialized techniques create possibilities for interaction with natural systems that could transform human relationship with ecological networks. Practitioners learning to communicate with and influence environmental processes through spiritual channels that bypass technological intermediaries. The master who can sense the health of forests, the flow of rivers, and the balance of atmospheric systems possesses capabilities that could guide civilization towards sustainable practices based on direct communication with natural intelligence, rather than theoretical understanding derived from external observation. The transcendence of conventional Haki applications into the realm of permanent spiritual imprinting represents the ultimate evolution of willpower made manifest. marking the transition from temporary effects that dissipate when conscious focus is withdrawn to lasting alterations in the fundamental nature of reality itself. This extraordinary capability appears to operate through mechanisms so profound that they challenge every assumption about the relationship between consciousness and physical existence, suggesting that sufficiently developed spiritual energy can create changes that persist across centuries or even millennia, embedded so deeply into the fabric of reality that they become indistinguishable from natural phenomena. The theoretical foundations underlying imprinted Haki rest upon principles that extend far beyond conventional understanding of how spiritual energy interacts with matter and consciousness, touching upon mysteries about the nature of time itself and the possibility that certain forms of will can transcend the limitations of individual mortality to become permanent features of the world. The evidence for such capabilities exists primarily in artifacts and phenomena that defy rational explanation, objects that continue to manifest spiritual effects long after their original creators have passed beyond the reach of living memory. The most compelling example of potentially imprinted Haki lies within the legendary knot that Joy Boy left behind as testament to powers that exceeded anything documented in subsequent history. The simple rope construction continuing to emanate spiritual pressure of such intensity that it could affect conscious beings who encountered it 800 years after its creation. The persistence of such overwhelming force across geological timescales suggests that Joy Boy's mastery had evolved beyond temporary technique deployment to achieve permanent alteration of physical matter through spiritual energy, so concentrated that it became self-sustaining. The implications of discovering spiritual effects that operate independently of their original source challenge fundamental assumptions about how Haki functions, moving beyond conventional understanding of willpower as a phenomenon that requires constant, conscious maintenance toward recognition that sufficiently advanced practitioners might be capable of creating lasting changes that continue, operating according to embedded instructions long after the practitioner's death. This possibility transforms the nature of spiritual legacy from inspiration and teaching to literal presence that persists through permanent modification of environmental conditions. The recent emergence of evidence suggesting that certain forms of Haki can affect beings previously considered immune to all spiritual and physical attacks has revolutionized understanding of what ultimate mastery might achieve, demonstrating that no defense or regenerative capability can withstand spiritual energy deployed according to principles that transcend conventional application methods. The wounds inflicted by masters who have achieved such transcendent technique appear to resist healing through mechanisms that operate beyond normal understanding of how damage and recovery function in biological systems. The theoretical battle between Scopper Garban and Saint Summers provided the most dramatic demonstration of how imprinted Haki might function in combat situations. The legendary former Roger Pirate, apparently possessing techniques that could embed spiritual energy directly into his opponent's essential nature, rather than merely coating his attacks with temporary enhancement. The inability of an immortal being to regenerate from injuries inflicted through such methods suggests that imprinted Haki operates by fundamentally altering the spiritual signature of whatever it touches, creating permanent modifications that prevent normal healing processes from recognizing and repairing the affected areas. This revolutionary application of spiritual energy appears to function by leaving portions of the practitioner's own Haki embedded within their targets, creating ongoing exposure to foreign spiritual energy that prevents natural recovery mechanisms from operating effectively. Where conventional attacks create temporary disruption that the body's inherent systems can eventually overcome, imprinted techniques establish permanent presence that continues interfering with healing processes as long as the embedded energy remains active. The duration for which such spiritual imprints can maintain their effectiveness appears to correlate directly with the original practitioner's level of mastery and the intensity of will that was invested in their creation. Joyboy's knot demonstrating that truly transcendent applications can persist across historical epochs, while lesser practitioners might achieve effects that last only years or decades. This variance in duration suggests that imprinted Haki requires not just technical skill but spiritual development that approaches the legendary consciousness so refined that it can create self-sustaining alterations in reality's basic structure. The energy requirements for achieving such permanent effects must exceed anything demanded by conventional Haki applications. The creation of lasting spiritual imprints, potentially requiring practitioners to invest significant portions of their total spiritual capacity in techniques that cannot be recovered or reused once deployed. This ultimate sacrifice of personal power for permanent effect speaks to mastery that transcends self-preservation to embrace purposes that extend far beyond individual survival or immediate tactical advantage. The philosophical implications of possessing abilities that can create permanent spiritual alterations raise profound questions about the responsibility that accompanies such overwhelming power, particularly when the effects of imprinted techniques might persist long enough to affect individuals who had no involvement in the original conflicts that created them. The practitioner capable of embedding lasting spiritual effects must consider not just immediate consequences, but potential impacts that could influence future generations, according to purposes and priorities that might become obsolete, morally questionable over time. The teaching possibilities for such transcendent capabilities remain entirely theoretical, as no documented tradition exists for systematically developing imprinting abilities through controlled practice or graduated training programs. The masters who achieve such heights appear to discover these techniques through desperate necessity or spontaneous breakthrough, rather than following established educational pathways. Their methods emerging from unique combinations of circumstance, natural talent, and spiritual development that resist systematic replication. The healing applications of imprinted Haki could theoretically revolutionize medical treatment by creating permanent beneficial alterations in biological systems, spiritual energy embedded in ways that provide ongoing therapeutic effects without requiring continued intervention from external sources. The practitioner who could imprint healing properties into injured tissues might achieve cures for conditions that currently require lifelong management, their spiritual energy continuing to guide recovery processes long after the original treatment session concluded. The environmental applications of permanent spiritual imprinting suggest possibilities for creating lasting improvements in natural systems, masters potentially able to embed beneficial effects that could restore degraded ecosystems or enhance agricultural productivity through alterations that persist across multiple growing seasons. The implications for addressing large-scale environmental challenges through spiritual intervention rather than technological solutions could transform approaches to conservation and resource management on scales that affect entire civilizations. The collaborative applications of imprinted techniques might enable multiple masters to coordinate their spiritual energies in ways that create compound effects exceeding anything achievable through individual effort. Their combined will embedded in locations or objects that serve as permanent reservoirs of beneficial spiritual energy. These collaborative imprints could theoretically provide protection for communities or regions that extends far beyond the lifespans of their creators. Spiritual guardianship that continues operating according to embedded intentions long after the original practitioners have passed away. The weapon enhancement possibilities offered by imprinted Haki extend far beyond the temporary black blade transformations achieved through conventional spiritual coating, potentially creating implements that possess permanent, supernatural properties, derived from embedded spiritual energy that cannot be depleted or dispelled through normal means. The legendary swords that have shaped history might represent early examples of such permanent enhancement, their exceptional capabilities derived from spiritual imprints left by masters, whose names have been forgotten, but whose will continues operating through the weapons they modified. The defensive applications of imprinted spiritual energy could enable the creation of permanent protective barriers that continue operating without requiring conscious maintenance from their creators. Locations or structures that possess embedded defensive capabilities, responding automatically to threats according to programmed spiritual instructions. These installations could provide sanctuary for future generations facing dangers that their creators could anticipate but not directly confront. Spiritual legacy that transcends individual mortality to serve purposes that extend across historical epochs. The detection and concealment applications of permanent spiritual imprinting might enable masters to create lasting surveillance or stealth effects that continue monitoring specific areas or hiding important locations long after the pose. Original practitioners have disappeared, their consciousness embedded in ways that maintain chosen purposes across whatever changes occur in local circumstances. These applications could preserve crucial information or protect vital resources through spiritual means that operate independently of technological systems or human oversight. And so we reach the horizon of our journey through the invisible currents that flow beneath the surface of all existence in the world of One Piece. From the thunderous proclamation of Conqueror's Haki that announces the presence of kings, to the gentle whisper of the voice of all things that connects hearts across time itself, we have witnessed how willpower becomes the truest form of strength. These abilities remind us that power is not merely physical force, but the manifestation of an unbreakable spirit, the determination to protect what matters most, and the courage to impose one's dreams upon a world that often seems determined to crush them. As you drift into peaceful slumber, let these tales of spiritual mastery carry you forward on currents of possibility, where even the impossible becomes achievable through sheer force of will. The greatest treasure is not gold or glory, but the strength to never surrender your convictions. Rest well, dreamer, and may your own willpower grow stronger with each passing tide.